Oh yeah, looks like it's.
To hide these options. There we go.
I can't see it through Zoom.
Okay, good. All right. Tyler should be set. Just trying to. Okay. We look good. You can hear and everything.
Yep, it says it's
All
recorded
right,
here.
got
Looks
it.
good.
Just kill this guy. It's
Yep, yep, we'll do. Yep, I think we're good to go.
All right, everybody, welcome to this week's Conservation Sciences Seminar. I'm going to turn it over to Levi to do the introduction since he has a closer relationship with Tyler than I do. So go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you all for being here today. We're excited to have Tyler Winter here today. He is an angler, conservationist, and environmental scientist. He is also a co-founder of Native Fish for Tomorrow, which is one of the only conservation organizations devoted to native rough fish. He's also a board member of Minnesota Conservation Federation and an active member of 3 additional conservation groups. He's always been passionate about Minnesota's fishes, but was unsure what could be done to conserve them just because they've been historically underrepresented and kind of misunderstood. Then through a series of random opportunities, he became the champion of Minnesota's Native Fish Bill, which is the first law in the nation to provide comprehensive reform for native rough fish. He hopes that his kind of non-traditional journey inspires other folks to get involved in conservation and hopefully make meaningful change. When he's not actively working on native fish conservation, he is probably outside with his children or fishing somewhere on the Mississippi River. And with that, I'll give it away to Tyler.
Thank you so much all for being here. As mentioned, I'm Tyler Winter, I'm co-founder of Native Fish for Tomorrow, and I know an invitation went out for this talk that listed me as doctor. I'm actually not a doctor. That's actually kind of important. My main qualifications are that I actually caught a moon eye once. I've caught more than one now. But I was about 14. I was fishing in a ditch by my grandma's house, and I caught this moon eye, and a silver fish jumped out of this muddy water, and I didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what it was. And that fish was so weird with teeth on its tongue and its big eye and its metallic reflection. It convinced me that if there were mysteries in the ditch, in this muddy ditch, that there were going to be mysteries in all of the water of Minnesota. And I've devoted my life to trying to understand that. Next thing you know, I'm catching a big mouth buffalo on a fishing show. Could happen to anybody, you know? And then I co-founded Native Fish for Tomorrow, a conservation group dedicated to applying the North American model of wildlife conservation to the so-called rough fish. And we built a coalition of conservation groups that reject the rough fish paradigm and are actively working alongside the Minnesota DNR to create a new native fish paradigm, which is also now the cover of the DNR's native fish calendar for 2025. And yes, those are my kids and their calendars. You're all required to take one. And together, we helped pass the very first comprehensive native fish conservation bill in the country. What do I mean when I say native fish? I'm talking about our native rough fish. The historically suckers, gar, bowfin, freshwater drum, burbot, whitefish and lake herring used to be as well, perch at one point, were considered, quote, rough fish. Unlike game fish, these fish were not stocked. So when you find them, be pretty sure they were actually always there. That's probably what unites them the most, is the fact that they are actually native. And there's so much diversity. This rough fish category has obscured this diversity. Just the suckers in Minnesota is 17 species. In North America, there's 77 species of native fish, or native suckers. They're not even all described yet. This is the most diverse group of this category. And then there's the ancient fish, the gar and the bowfin. Now we've got 9 species total, 7 species of gar in the world, 2 species of bowfin now. And these fish have unique biology and development. They're not just teleosts with thick scales. You may note the tail filament on that juvenile gar. These fish are so weird. Completely understudied. And then the moon-eye diversity. Now, I mean, we are getting slightly less diverse. There's actually only 2 species of fish in this entire order, the Heodontiforms. Now, both of these species are hosts to a federally endangered mussel that lives in the St. Croix River. It is that connection that is actually finally getting these fish some research. And we just recently learned the moon eyes in the St. Croix will migrate 98 miles down into the Mississippi and back. That was completely unknown. Also, a fun fact, moon eye was actually not listed in the previous definition of rough fish. That's how incomplete the legal definition was. And then there's the diversity in the freshwater drum group, actually only 1 species. But this is probably the most underappreciated fish in all of Minnesota. They range from Hudson Bay to Guatemala. They are host to 11 species of native fish. They can live, or native mussels. They can live to be 75 years old. They eat zebra mussels. Maybe 50% of their diet can be zebra mussels. They taste good. Their eggs float, which actually probably leads to them being extirpated above a lot of dams, maybe 6% of dams, which is bad because they host those native mussels. So these fish are completely underappreciated. They're providing so many ecosystem services, though. And these fish do provide so many ecosystem services, which is why we can't just have a few. It's not enough to just preserve these fish in an arc. You need a lot of fish to actually carry out ecosystem services. Some, like the black buffalo up there, are threatened species in Minnesota and Wisconsin. As mentioned, they eat zebra mussels. They host native mussels. They're prey for charismatic megafauna. They're food for people, including myself. And suckers help with stream habitat, transport nutrients. All of this was obscured by this rough fish paradigm, this idea that these fish have no value. And it's not hard to track down the origins of this paradigm. This is not a conspiracy theory. They just wrote it down. The very first Fish Commission report of Minnesota from 1875 divides fish into the commercially important species and the vermin of the waters, including sturgeon. Now, sturgeon have made that leap from vermin to trophy, and we're about 100 years behind on doing that for the rest of our native fish. In 1890, the Fish Commission reports noted that carp were especially popular with the German immigrant community. In 1907, the rough fish paradigm was actually enshrined into state law. I don't believe at first there was actually even a definition. It was kind of a you know it when you see it thing. But these species that were associated with immigrant and underprivileged communities, they ended up on the rough list. So that changed over time. Turtles were on it at one point. Yellow perch were on it. But it was never based on any sort of biological, basis. And there are a few explanations about the origin of the rough part of it. One is that there was coarse fishing in England, or that these fish were rough dressed by commercial fishermen. But in any case, the divide really comes down to sport fishing. In the beginnings of people actually taking vacations, train companies were advertising that they were like a fishing line, like the fishing destination. They would give free passage to train cars to stock fish at the end of the line so they could sell tickets. And people who had the privilege to go on vacations and catch fish that they weren't going to eat did that. And people who've had to fish in warm waters at larger cities, often in polluted water for big fish for food, those are the fish that ended up on the rough list. So it's the origins really come down to the way that people make identity with fish in a way that they don't with other animals, right? I don't believe this sort of divide happens with bird watching where people are like, oh, I would never look at a duck. Yeah. But when you ask somebody, what are they, if they're a fisherman, they're like, oh, I'm a bass fisherman. Whatever. Like, and it's like, we're creating identity with that, which is, it's fine to create identity, but you shouldn't make part of your identity the negative, the denigrating of something. Over time, this just became like institutionalized and normalized. The long-nosed sucker is in decline in Minnesota. These used to range across northern Minnesota, but they're cold water fish. And so these lakes that they used to live in were reclaimed with rotenone to make room for trout. This lake, these series of lakes, Kimball, Mink, and Boys, used to have lake long-nosed suckers. They, when these lakes were reclaimed in 2013, no long-nosed suckers were harmed because they never recolonized after the initial reclamation. So these lakes have been like reclaimed multiple times, which kind of like reveals, and then you end up applying poisons and building barriers, which not typically how we do conservation. And these things are so normalized. When I became a member of the Isaac Walton League, this was actually part of the bylaws for my chapter. Nobody had updated the bylaws in like 30 years, but it was like just, normalized at the time. My chapter started a resolution that actually went to the National Convention for the 100th year anniversary of the Isaac Walton League, where they passed a resolution calling on all state agencies to, holistically manage non-game and game fish. And eventually, fishing evolved to a point where catching and releasing of trout was completely normal, and eating suckers became newsworthy. And over the next century, these classes' origins of the paradigm were replaced by just this implicit belief. It was just like, fish were better than others. People didn't question it. This image, though, was taken from a YouTube video where people were bragging about killing gar. And people were disgusted. But they weren't outraged until it was investigated and found that they hadn't actually broken the law, which that really made people mad. And that inspired the 2021 GAR bill, which directed the Minnesota DNR to create a limit for GAR, finally ending their unlimited harvest. It's important to understand the legal underpinnings, the legal framework wherever you're working. Minnesota is a permissive state. Our game and fish laws list what you may do. All other things are considered illegal. Some states do the opposite. They list what is illegal and everything else is assumed to be legal. So with Minnesota being a permissive state like that, the idea that killing 82 gar for no reason was legal was very upsetting to people, right? Because that implies that our legal framework actually endorsed that. Who here is familiar with the North American model of wildlife conservation? Excellent. Because this is the framework really that guides us in all of our work across the country. And it's responsible for the hits as having turkeys everywhere, right? That wasn't always the case. And that's why we want to build on at Native Fish for Tomorrow. We want to build on that success, and follow that model. The North American model has 7 principles. 6 of them have been violated by the rough fish paradigm. These fish have not been conserved. They've been intentionally eliminated. We've had unlimited sale of recreationally harvested fish. Gaps and contradictions in state law have meant that some laws, like the wanton waste law, have not been able to be enforced. These fish have been killed for no reason, often mistaken for invasive species, or to reclaim lakes. There's been no accommodations for cross-jurisdictional species. Fish that are listed as threatened in Wisconsin have been unregulated in Minnesota. And they've been co-managed with invasive species, which is unscientific and indefensible. So applying these principles to the principles of the North American model of wildlife management is necessary. In fact, it's reflected in our state law. Minnesota Constitution says that fish should be managed by law and regulation for the public good. And the public good is not met with one fish, but by them fulfilling their ecosystem services, being available to the public. It's also in statute. So that gives us a basis to like work on this and solve this. You know, this is another principle of the North American model. This basically directly addresses principle 4. We're not going to kill fish for illegitimate reasons. We're going to have a use for them. Although, you know, we still have progress to make. People are still advertising that fish disposal is provided. So how do we get there? I know this is a science seminar, and you may have noticed I didn't have a lot of graphs in the beginning. This is a trend analysis for white sucker catch per unit effort, and it shows a 50% decline for trap net harvest. This is across the state. This was published in 2015. I don't know if there are any, I didn't see any changes that happened because of this. You see, because not everyone actually understands the value of white suckers. Fish IBIs consider them as an indicator of poor water quality because they are, quote, generalist feeders. So with that attitude, you might actually see this decline as a positive. But we actually now know that the white suckers are like preyed upon by wolves. They're migratory species that go into small streams in the spring. They're culturally important. The suckerfish moon is February. They're commercially important. Even a small sucker is worth over $1. And they're food for eagles. That's why eagles lay their eggs so early in the spring that they get snow on the nest in the eagle cam, because they want to be able to feed their chicks when these fish are spawning. I could literally talk for an hour just about the importance of white suckers in Minnesota, but I won't, because you can just listen to the Fish of the Week podcast. So to inspire action, you must provide a normative context. You have to give the subject a positive value. You can't assume that everyone shares the same values as you do, right? Even the sturgeon used to be devalued. Think about the struggles of getting conservation for spotted owls or snail darters or something, right? You don't want to create make these fish into a problem. You have to share that value. Values that are reflected in the North American model. Now, I'm not trying to diminish the role of science. After all, scientific management is also enshrined in the North American model. However, the science has to be applied to hold wildlife in the public trust and provide for the public good. So there is value there, right? And working together and collaborating with scientists is incredibly important, in part because they give us so much to talk about. The counter argument, and I've literally sat in rooms and heard this, is that everything is fine. You know, show me the data, point to the problem. And then once they've derailed you, then you quibble over where did the data come from? Do you see this trend? Do you see that trend? The problem we're really dealing with is a socio-ecological system problem, right? The problem is here. The problem is in the fact that we have not been prioritizing the whole ecosystem and the ecosystem services provided by these fish. It's more than just piles of dead fish. It's the barriers, it's the habitat, it's the science, the funding, it's all of those things, right? It's not just that. So we need to shift this entire system. We need to educate the public and get people engaged. One of the feedback loops I see, I call the trash cycle, right? And it starts by conflating native and invasive species, because there's been so much more education and outreach around the invasive species than native. I talk to people on a regular basis who tell me, oh, I caught a snakehead. And I'm like, if you caught a snakehead, it would be national news. You caught a bowfin, where they see buffalo and they think they are carp. And then they think, oh, the water's so impaired, it only has invasive species in it. I might as well just throw my trash in there too. And then the people who still use those resources are considered, how should we say, trashy? And they don't get amenities. They get fences and no fishing signs. And then nobody goes. And then people are allowed to continue having a negative perception of that ecosystem and the animals in it because they don't learn about it. And it feeds back on itself. I talk to people who haven't fished across the street from their house, even though they go on vacations to fish. And then they throw their yard debris where me and my kids fish. But we can change that. We could have a native fish cycle. You could leverage, and we are leveraging the visibility of these fish because they are large body to inspire new stakeholders. People can sustainably harvest these fish for legitimate purposes. For example, this photo has appeared, last one, me holding a buffalo, has appeared in multiple news stories. I also harvested that fish. We turned the fillets into fish sticks, and I donated the carcass and the head for an age analysis. And these are other positive feedback loops we can leverage. The Sport Fish Restoration Fund, an excise tax on fishing equipment that goes back into management and research. And sometimes fishing is the answer. Fishing can make a story because it makes the subject accessible, gives it value. And this is where partners and collaborators can really shine. To stand up and be the stakeholder who says, this is important to me. And if you are really nice and work well with others, you can address the problem from multiple directions. Because remember, in the socioeconomic system schematic, there are two boxes, right? Both anglers advocating and the feedback from the larger organizations. And I have been so proud. The Minnesota DNR has been a great partner in this effort. And you need help. The Isaac Walton League, and I was on a team with the Isaac Walton League, we filed a legal petition for administrative rulemaking. And we had experts who were able to help us guide this process and understand the legal part of it. And the Isaac Walton League, and then we worked with the Minnesota DNR stakeholder work group. And you also need to get relationships with lawmakers in the legislature to build rapport with legislators who are going to have to sponsor bills. And then all I have to do really is be the guy who shows up to say, I care, we care. The first bill I testified for was a report on the status of rough fish. This laid the groundwork for the native fish bill. And the Minnesota DNR also has a technical change bill, like every year, to fix, random things, dates, and improve the state wildlife laws. In 2023, they proposed an amendment to the wanton waste law. They added this section does not apply to common carp. And they did it to provide greater protection for all native fish, because this was the first time that invasive fish were separated from the native fish in statute. They would be treated differently. I mean, I may have wrote an email about, asking why invasive species were protected by a wanton waste law, but, once the official report was done, that was funded by the no junk fish bill, and the Isaac Walton League work group and petition project wrapped up, the native fish bill was drafted. I had the privilege of testifying for the native fish bill 4 times alongside DNR staff. And not once was I actually asked for credentials. It turns out that the legislative process is actually open to the public. And you can just go to hearings and testify. The first time I actually showed up to a hearing to testify, I kept expecting there to be a guard as I'm walking down hallways. I'm like, there's got to be some place where I check in. No, actually, you can just walk in. And it's really shocking how few people get involved. The Senate author for the bill, for the native fish bill, during the committee hearing, he held up all of the written testimony that had been submitted. And he said, there has been an outpouring of public support. And there were 11 pieces of written testimony were actually submitted. And that did qualify as an outpour. Other bills had less. They were all in favor. And I had reached out to people and made sure everyone knew when this was going to happen, right? And we got it together. And we passed through that committee hearing with like no opposition and very few questions. Getting involved is like the first step. Public service announcement, do not try to read the text in the upcoming slides. The point of putting up all this text is just to show how dense and complicated all of this is. And sometimes there just isn't a good picture. But this is a summary of the native fish bill. It amended 41 statutes in state law, many of which have been in place for over 100 years. And we were able to make those amendments so that we can align the state laws with the North American model. First and foremost, the biggest change is that we separated native and invasive species. No longer would they be managed together. We got a new definition. You can see here, we have goldeye, but no mooneye, no scientific names. Honest, like just so completely inadequate that at one point I was asked in a hearing, what fish does this apply to? And I was like, that's a good question. That's why we need the report. And now we have scientific names, covers 26 species. And Muna sees all comes full circle. A lot of these things were just find and replace. This was a very long statute. It's a favorite example of mine of a random thing. This statute makes clear that Minnesota still has jurisdiction over the waters of the Superior National Forest. Gives the commissioner the option to remove them. Not a hill to die on. They don't actually do removals up there. So that's one of those things. Pick your battles. The state wants to exercise its jurisdiction over these waters. And, when you're getting everything else you ask for, just find and replace. But there were key places where the phrase native rough fish was inserted next to game fish. These three statutes were all things that actually applied to minnows, mussel shells, game fish, liability for restitution. So you can actually assign a value in law for these animals. Taking away a license after a conviction for buying and selling. And making it illegal to transport more than a possession limit, right? Prior to that, you could be driving through the state of Minnesota with a trailer full of fish and be like, I'm just transporting them. I bought them from somebody. And they don't have a value in statute anyway. They have no restitution value. So I don't have to pay the state anything for if I had committed a crime. So these three things are huge. They're going to allow the enforcement of upcoming possession limits. There are even habitat things. Previously, it's said in state law that funds could be used for, quote, rough fish barriers. Now, barriers can only be for invasive species, not for native species. But now there's still a rulemaking process. We fixed the statutes, and I'm incredibly proud of that because we went back to the statutes and fixed those underlying things so that we could have the changes we needed instead of a patchwork sort of response. And we did it for all these species at once. Previously, maybe fish came off of the rough list, but there was never a comprehensive reform of all the laws. It's like, we'll just take, lake whitefish off the list. So now we have the comprehensive reform. There's still a rulemaking process. This is also where taking a class on law and environment, super handy. I did not know about the rulemaking process when I started this. Was not covered in my education. The rulemaking process can take up to 2 years. This is where you get, to the regulations book. These are the plain language version of your administrative laws. And you then get, we don't expect that there's going to be major changes for, that are going to impact the law-abiding angler, because who needs more than 10 gar at a time? And if you do, you can get a permit for research. But the benefits of a new native fish paradigm are incalculable. Because not only are we supporting our ecosystems and living up to our ideals, but we are inspiring a new generation of conservationists. And I want to say, because I don't have big qualifications, I wasn't appointed to anything, no fellowships. I have found that opportunities come to those people who are nice. The only way, especially that a state employee can get rid of you, is if you are mean to them. And then they can go to their boss and say, I'm not dealing with this person. They were very rude and unprofessional. As long as you are nice, and I oftentimes would write emails, I would just ask a question. If you don't get a response, it means you asked a very good question. There isn't an easy answer. Always a little sad when you get a quick response. You're like, I missed something that explained that. Ask questions, be incredibly polite, and communicate constantly. Reach out to people before you need their help. Build relationships, connect with them. You do that, and then you're the person they think of when something comes up. And when you have that opportunity, show up. Show up consistently, show up early. If you show up, you get shortlisted for the next opportunity. They'll call you first. And then dress appropriately. Field, testifying, whatever. Literally, that gets you through so much. And then, talk. But if you make a mistake, like I did today, it's not a big deal. You just correct yourself. You give an interview and you're like, I should have not said that. You contact the person, you're like, hey, I was joking when I said, and it's fine. Don't be super worried about getting everything perfect. Show up. That's the number one thing. I want to thank the Native Bill supporters, the Native Fish Bill supporters, the Isaac Walton, the Nature Conservancy, Minnesota Conservation Federation, and I want to give a special thanks to people and reporters. Miles was the person who reached out to me and wanted to do a fishing show about bigmouth buffalo, and that was really the first chance I had to tell that story, be part of it, and that led to so many more opportunities. Joe Stramelli, Ryan Callahan have championed this issue, and local reporting by St. Croix 360 in Northern. Probably went too fast. Are there questions?
I think on setting limits now where you don't really have very good information, for instance, well, better than take whatever you want.
Yeah. So possession limits don't actually work in the way we would think. There's a limit of 6 bass. People don't eat bass anymore. You can't get people to eat bass. But the limit of 6 conveys the value of them. There's a limit of 1 muskie. Nobody keeps muskie. Sturgeon. There was like 1 sturgeon harvested on the St. Croix. So you need to inform that socioeconomic system. If you actually want a limit that's scientifically based, you're getting into tags, mandatory reporting. We don't do that even for game fish. We're not going to have a framework. We're not going to have a legal framework that goes beyond what is established for game fish. And so we're going to have limits that are close to game fish, probably on the high side of game fish is where we're going to end up. Limits from 6 to 20. And that's incredibly important. People literally would just say, well, it's unlimited. It's unlimited harvest. People would say to me, the DNR wants me to kill them. It's unlimited harvest. You If you pick a number that's under 50, people understand that it has a value. It's not unlimited.
Maybe for bow fishing where you can't catch and release, that you need to have limits that might be in aggregate across species.
Yeah, so that's another thing. The framework we have right now, game fish are often regulated by genus. They're combined. It's sunfish combined. Once again, if we were really going to have hard science fishing regulations, you would split out black and white crappies. We don't do that. And so yes, there are going to be limits in aggregate. It's going to be very similar layout to the existing framework. There is absolutely interest in it. I think that the other states are probably going to see how it goes in Minnesota. I'm expecting that they're going to wait a year or two and realize like the wheels don't fall off. It turns out that lakes and streams are not cornfields. Weeding does not increase production. When you take fish out, you just have less fish. Because if you have freshwater drummen eating zebra mussels, you're expanding the actual pie. Those zebra mussels aren't necessarily available to walleyes. They're not, there may be some diet overlap, but you're making the pie bigger. And then it's free fish. People are spending how much on stocking, right? And I'm like, I can recruit so many anglers to go out and fish and catch big fish. I love taking people out and they catch the biggest fish of their life. And I'm like, yeah, that's normal. And it doesn't cost anything, part of this is just, we separating native and invasive species, giving them the regulations, that actually support and reflect their value. And it's not going to cause any, adverse impacts in Minnesota. I think people just want to see that.
The native fish bill come with legislative funding to help get some of these initiatives off the ground? Because so many of the management decisions are driven by license sales and recreational activities.
Yeah, which is interesting because funding is actually not part of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Probably to keep a positive feedback loop from happening where people try to manage our lakes and streams as some sort of Disneyland-like park. We're supposed to be managing our resources for the public good, not to maximize license sales. Not to say that that doesn't happen to some degree. But the other thing is, this isn't actually going to cost money, really. We have to do the administrative rulemaking. The statute's changed. The no junk fish bill actually came with funding for native fish biologists. So there is that on an ongoing basis. So some funding to implement it.
For bow fishers or commercial fishers.
So commercial fishing in Minnesota is regulated separately. And that's actually very interesting the way it's done. In a lot of states and a lot of places, you have the tragedy of the commons. In Minnesota, each commercial fisherman is restricted to a specific district. They're responsible for the lakes in their district. And conversations with them have been really incredible. Those guys are more concerned with the conservation of their fish stocks than almost anybody else. And I've heard things like, oh no, we wouldn't take the 30 pounders. That's where we, get the eggs for the next generation. They're also like, that's not where the market is. We want small ones. So we leave the big ones and only harvest, the 5 to 10 pounders, what we can sell. They're invested in the future of that. I think there may be some, reforms going forward or some maybe increased oversight by the Minnesota DNR. But really I want to focus on the fact that these reforms and what the needed changes are really bigger than just harvest, because you can't harvest fish that are not spawning because of dams. You can't harvest fish that are not there because the stream is so degraded because it doesn't have water quality protections. Those sort of things. And you know, I think bow fishers may come up to limits that are in the future if depending on where those limits land and how good they are. That being said, these are possession limits. If you eat the fish that you harvest, you can go get more.
Is part of the native fish bill, just, is there any emphasis on like gathering? Well, I would assume there's a lot of like foundational, like life history and ecology of these species that have been like under researched historically.
So this bill is really focused on statute reforms. The no junk fish bill that happened the year before, and the that report that was funded by the legislature, DNR completed. That report listed quite a few research needs. And those research things have been funded by the LCCMR.
Do you know how this legislation impacts commercial fishing?
It doesn't directly. The one thing it does do, it does end the sale of recreationally harvested fish. It also, wait, there was a thing. I should have put this on the slide. It took bowfin off of the list of commercial species.
That recently just talked with a commercial fisherman, and I was gonna ask if there was any truth to that, so
Yeah,
that's good to hear.
that was actually an Easter egg. I was reading through the bill and that showed up and I was like, I didn't even ask for that. Which it sounds totally random, but there is an emerging caviar fishery for bowfin in other states. The caviar industry doesn't have a great track record. I love this audience because you can make a joke like that and get a laugh. I mean, like this, you're the right group of people to be presenting to.
Yes, and maybe this is a down the road type of thing, but you mentioned a little bit on connectivity and barriers and how to balance that with invasive and native species going forward. Whether the native fish bill did anything to set up how that would be handled in the future, or
no, and that's, you know, one of those long-term things. Barriers, you know, anyone who works on streams or freshwater fish, you know, barriers are like the worst. That's not laid out in here. Native Fish for Tomorrow, obviously we advocate for dam removals. We also want to stop the spread of invasive species, which is why we hope to see deterrence downstream. My nightmare is that we fail at that and we end up with a whole new generation of carp barriers that comes up across the landscape. There are already so many dams in Minnesota, and we don't need reason to build more.
I don't think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, I can't see it. Yeah, it's about how COVID affected showing up at legislative events. I don't know if you ever ran into that when you were. Yes, I testified in virtually for an early bill at one point. I would honestly, as far as it goes, showing up, COVID or otherwise, every committee has like a newsletter that will have lists of bills that are coming up and when and where to submit testimony. If you are interested in policy, advocating, you know, showing up, being involved, or just curious what's coming down the line, sign up to those. You get so many emails, scan them. If you see something interesting, write a paragraph. It doesn't even have to be good. I'm not sure that they get read. But if you put on the opening line, I support, that's what matters, you know, or I oppose. Sign up to a committee that covers something that you care about. Because yeah, your written testimony may tip the balance.
you know.
We have till one, there's a couple minutes left, I'm sure we'd be happy to discuss anything with anybody that would like to. We have, something over here.
Oh, well, I mean, everyone does have to take a calendar.
Calendars over here. These are planned. Yeah, those are, nice, Minnesota native fish calendars here, and thank you, Tyler, for a really great talk.
That's like. I don't know. I'm glad you let me some.
Yeah, like, we'll see, but like. On the Zoom, I saw it, at least, so at least that's out there,
Whatever.
but, you know, I think.
We got the talk.
Yeah. Yeah, it is recording.